which country would win World War III? To be truthful, this is a bit of a difficult question to answer because a lot of it would depend on where the war begins, what it's over, and of course, I am not a fortune teller, so it's impossible to say for sure, but we can always look at the things we do know and draw whatever conclusions we wish. So let's do that. Firstly, where in our 2022 world would a world war likely break out, should it unfortunately come to that? I think the most obvious answer right now would be Russia or Ukraine. Of course, there has been conflict there for quite some time, and each day the tensions rise with more countries listening in and beginning to get involved, although carefully and conservatively. The real root of this conflict that is ongoing truly does stem all the way back to the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Ukraine, which is a former Soviet republic, went on to have the third largest atomic arsenal in the world after the breakup of the Soviet Union. This led to both the United States and Russia working to denuclearize the country, and after coming to a series of agreements, Ukraine gave their nuclear warheads to Russia in exchange for security that would prevent them from a Russian attack. Then, flash forward to 2014, Russia invades Ukraine. The conflict has only risen, and it's become worse over time, however, and it really is about the future of Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin sees Ukraine as a place or a way that Russia can show its influence in Europe and really to the rest of the world, and he is seemingly willing to launch another invasion on the country at any time. But this time, unlike what happened in 2014, more people and more countries, including Ukraine itself, are prepared. In 2014, the US was slow to react to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. This is because at the time, President Barack Obama was a little hesitant to react because he didn't want to escalate tensions with Russia. This led to the delay in the mobilization of diplomatic response in Europe, and Ukrainians were left without offensive weapons. That is not the case this time. In terms of this conflict at this point in time, both Russia and the US have drawn their lines in the sand. Russia presented the US with a list of demands that they had, and the US chose to reject some of those. US President Joe Biden is reportedly trying to renegotiate some of these terms and include some things that certainly would be of interest to Russia, such as the stationing of ground-launched missile systems in Ukraine or Eastern Europe, and this is all in an attempt to keep an all-out war from happening. One of the many on the list of demands was a ban on Ukraine from joining the NATO, something that both the US and the NATO itself rejected. Ukraine has a right to choose its own geopolitical alignments. Basically, this just scratches the surface on what is going on with that conflict right now, but experts are warning that the possibility of invasion is high, and invasion might mean the beginning of something that none of us want to see. Russia continues to deny that there is a planned attack, but there are currently about 130,000 troops fully equipped located right at Ukraine's border. So, if this is the beginning of the war, if this is how World War III begins, what will happen from there? Right now, there are talks of the growing positive relationship between China and Russia. This puts an interesting twist on things because right now, the three biggest military powers in the world are Russia, China, and the United States. China is agreeing with Russia, and it's also opposed to the expansion of the NATO, with Putin claiming that Western powers are using the NATO defense alliance to undermine Russia. Now, this is interesting because it also feeds into the current conflict that is going on in Taiwan. China's leader has been very vocal about how he believes that his path to national rejuvenation cannot be complete and successful until Taiwan unifies with the mainland, whether they want to or not, but Taiwan still insists that they are independent. So it's sort of similar to how Russia wants Ukraine, how Putin suggests that the Russian people and the Ukrainian people are all one, despite those in Ukraine not at all feeling the same. These two situations mirror each other on how the two leaders are willing to invade and even go to war to take over these unwilling territories, but the difference between them is that the People's Liberation Army really is going so strong and confident in their beliefs that, given their economic and military strength, should anyone else, including the US, choose to intervene, they doubt it would end up swaying them from their goal in the end. This would prove to be even more troublesome for the US, since if Taiwan were to fall into the hands of the Chinese government, the US would have a harder time defending its critical allies, Japan and the Philippines. This is all important because these similarities in situations might continue to draw Russia and China together if their bonding over wanting to dominate Western powers isn't enough. If the two were to sort of team up, for lack lack of a better way to put it, the US and the NATO in general might have a much harder time fighting back. Right now, the US is in a bit of a precarious place. Sending troops and resources to Taiwan takes them away from Ukraine, and vice versa. There's enough to go around, but it definitely spreads things thin, which is a lot less than ideal. This means that in order to protect both places, Europe needs to build up their own defense, and truthfully, since 2014, Ukraine has been doing just that. I mean, the NATO allies spend a lot more on their militaries than Russia does, and the US can bolster them with support and weapons, and they can still be committed to helping and defending, but in a more constrained capacity that would allow them to keep their focus elsewhere as well. I'm not saying that this is the best option, I'm just putting forward hypothetical scenarios. The worry is that China will use the Russia-Ukraine conflict as a window of US distraction in order to act and invade Taiwan. But the same could be said in the opposite scenario, so it's tough to find the right balance. Here's the thing. While those at the moment are the places and reasons where and why a world war could break out, we have to think of the logistics of it following that. If Russia and China were to team up together, that would be bad for the United States, but that does not mean that the two could just waltz into the United States, invade, and take claim. That is far from happening. The United States would be virtually impossible to invade. At the start of the war, not only would US forces come up to Canada, but they would also extend down south as well into Mexico. No chance of invading coastal US cities because of both submarine and air power. If invading from the north or the south, there would be miles of land and hundreds of people to get through first, which would end up depleting most of your resources before even getting to the US border. On the other hand, an invasion of Russia would be disastrous. Russia is huge. It's the same deal if someone tried to invade the US by coming through Canada. There is so much ground to cover. Most of your resources are going to be wasted just crossing the international distance and then the domestic distances just for an attack. So if invasion isn't really an option, that leaves one big scary option, and that is long distance weaponry. Of course, I'm talking about missiles and the like, and unfortunately with that comes the talk of nuclear weaponry. If we were simply talking about numbers like spending budget, numbers in fleets, that sort of thing, we would only be talking about China and the US. In terms of spending and budget, the US defense budget sits at an approximate $705 billion in 2021, while China's defense spending in 2021 was a number of around $209 billion once converted into US dollars. So of course the US budget is way larger, but China does not have the high costs of paying an all-volunteer force, and China's military activities are largely focused on East Asia, while the US has a footprint all over the world. This means that while the gap in spending seems to be huge, it's not quite as large as it may appear on the surface. If we look into resources and warships, China is leading the US in terms of combat vessels. I mean, there are shipyards absolutely pumping out new warships on a weekly basis, but the turn of this is that while they have more, they are of lesser quality. US ships are ton for ton larger, they are better offensively and defensively, and they are manned by more experienced crews. This is all to say that both have their own advantages and disadvantages, and it's not exactly clear which one is just all out stronger and better or who would win over the other. While the idea of Russia and China is definitely a terrifying one for us in the Western world, it's important to note the allies of the US who would be extremely helpful in the war. The US has a larger network of allies than China does. In Asia, this means Japan, the third largest economy in the world. It means Australia, who brings very capable naval forces. This means South Korea, Singapore, and many others, but one of the curveballs is likely to be India. For years, India hasn't been on the list of top and most powerful militaries, but that is very quickly changing. Very soon, India is definitely on track to become a military superpower. In fact, India is number 4 when it comes to the strongest militaries in the world, and they are in the midst of a total overhaul, which is doing a lot to strengthen their forces. There's plans being made to integrate the Navy and the Air Force, and doing so would make these unified armed forces easier for the US, the UK, and Australia to team up with as well. While China has the largest standing army in the world at 2.1 million troops, an allyship with India would give the US a much needed upper hand, considering they are second with 1.2 million ground troops and another 960,000 reserve officers. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that it's tough to say who would win World War III should it it ever come to that. I mean, truthfully, no one really wins a war. Everyone is depleted by the end. Resources are scarce, economies take a hit, and there is a drastic loss of life which should always be avoided at all costs. It's also important to note that with the likelihood of a mass amount of nuclear weapons being used in a third world war, it's possible that no one will win because there might not be anyone left. I think that should nuclear power not entirely destroy our world, the US is likely to come out on top. Since I live in the Western world, there is possibly bias in that answer, but I truly do believe that the allyships and relationships with other countries would give us the upper hand when it comes to a world war. Russia is powerful and scary, but one country's allyship does not a world war win. Alright guys, that has been our LBQ for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. Stay curious, my friends, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!